David Hargrave sat alone in the dim glow of his computer screens when the signal arrived. A whisper from the void that carried words no star should know, words that claimed to come from a witness who watched the sky go dark over Jerusalem as Jesus died. The frequency pulsed through the radio telescope array like a heartbeat, steady and impossible, cutting through layers of cosmic noise with surgical precision that defied every law of natural phenomena. His hands trembled above the keyboard as the decryption software began parsing the transmission, each decoded segment revealing phrases in ancient Aramaic, a language dead for centuries, yet somehow traveling across light years of empty space. The signal contained no mathematical proofs, no universal constants, none of the carefully constructed greetings humanity had imagined first contact might bring. Instead, it spoke of dust and blood, of nails driven through flesh, of a hill called Golgotha, where the fabric of reality itself had torn. David's breath caught in his throat as the translation scrolled across his monitor, each phrase impossibly specific, impossibly reverent. "I was there," the message read, repeating like a confession. "I saw the darkness fall at midday. I felt the earth shudder beneath feet that had walked 1,000 worlds." The words seemed to burn themselves into his vision, and with them came coordinates, not celestial positions marking some distant star system, but terrestrial ones, pointing to a location in the Negev desert. David sat frozen, his coffee growing cold, his carefully ordered world of mathematics and empirical evidence crumbling around the simple, terrifying possibility that something ancient and vast had been watching. Earth's most sacred moment. The signal continued to pulse, patient and eternal, waiting for a response that David wasn't sure he had the courage to give. The night air bit cold against his skin as he stood 3 days later beneath an ocean of stars. The desert stretched infinite and silent around him. He had driven for hours following the coordinates, abandoning his post at the observatory without explanation, driven by a compulsion he couldn't name and didn't dare examine too closely. The location was unmarked, indistinguishable from 1,000 other patches of ancient sand and stone, yet something in his chest told him he was exactly where he needed to be. David's scientific mind screamed that this was madness, that signals from space didn't contain prophecy, that his career and reputation were disintegrating with every moment he spent chasing phantoms in the wilderness. But another part of him, a part that remembered childhood prayers and his grandmother's weathered Bible, whispered that some truths transcend telescopes and equations. The stars above seemed brighter here, closer, as if the veil between heaven and earth wore thin in this forgotten place. He stood with his arms wrapped around himself against the chill, feeling simultaneously insignificant and chosen, a speck of consciousness suspended between the infinite above and the ancient below. The wind carried no sound except its own voice, a susurrus that might have been there since the world was young. Then, between one heartbeat and the next, the air before him began to shimmer with light that had no source. David's legs locked, his breath trapped in his lungs, as the luminous form took shape against the darkness, not threatening, not alien in the monstrous sense he'd imagined, but other, profoundly other. The being stood taller than any man, composed of light that somehow suggested solidity, with eyes that held depths no human gaze could match. "David Hargrave," the being spoke, and the voice resonated not in the air, but directly in the space behind his thoughts, gentle yet unmistakable. "I am called Aaron, and I have waited a long time to speak with one who might understand." The astronomer's knees nearly buckled, his carefully constructed atheism, or agnosticism, or whatever comfortable label he'd hidden behind, evaporating like morning dew under a desert sun. Aaron moved closer, each step leaving faint impressions of light on the sand that faded like footprints on water, and David found himself unable to retreat, unable to flee, pinned not by fear, but by a curiosity so intense it bordered on pain. "You received my signal," Aaron continued, and there was something like relief in that ethereal voice. You came, despite all logic screaming against it, because part of you knows that the universe is stranger and more sacred than your instruments can measure." David's mouth worked soundlessly, 1,000 questions fighting for voice, but only one emerged as a hoarse whisper. "The message. You said you saw—" He couldn't finish, couldn't speak those words aloud, as if naming them might shatter whatever. Impossible moment this was. Aaron's luminous form seemed to dim slightly, taking on an aspect that David's mind translated as sorrow, as remembrance of something that had marked the being across millennia. "Yes," Aaron said softly, "I was there, on the hill outside Jerusalem, when the man you call Jesus of Nazareth drew his final breath." The stars above seemed to pulse in rhythm with those words, and David felt the ground beneath him become suddenly sacred. "I have walked your world for 2,000 years, David, studying, searching, trying to understand what I witnessed that day, the moment when a single death sent ripples through the very fabric of existence." David sank to his knees in the sand, not in worship, but because his legs would no longer support him, his mind reeling with implications that shattered every boundary between faith and cosmos. Aaron remained standing, patient as stone, ancient as starlight, his form casting an impossible glow across the desert floor that transformed the barren landscape into something that might have been Eden before the fall. "I need you to understand," the being said, and now his voice carried an urgency that transcended species, transcended worlds. "I have traveled between stars, witnessed civilizations rise and crumble into cosmic dust, observed phenomena that would drive human minds to madness, but nothing in all my ages prepared me for what I saw on Golgotha." David looked up at this impossible messenger, tears streaming down his face without his permission, and found himself asking the question that would change everything. "Why are you telling me this?" Aaron's eyes, if they could be called eyes, held galaxies and grief in equal measure. "Because my people are dying, David. We have mastered matter and energy, bent space to our will, but we are hollow, empty, fading into a darkness no technology can illuminate." The wind died completely, leaving a silence so profound that David could hear his own heart hammering against his ribs. "And I have come to believe that the answer to our salvation, the key to understanding what we have lost, lies in the moment I witnessed 2 millennia ago, when love proved stronger than death." The stars above seemed to burn brighter, and David felt himself standing at the intersection of everything his telescopes had sought and everything his abandoned faith had promised. In that desert night, with an alien being confessing belief in Christ's sacrifice, the astronomer understood that he had been chosen not to discover new worlds, but to reveal that the greatest truth in the universe had already been spoken on a criminal's cross. The silence stretched between them like a held breath, and then Aaron began to speak in tones that carried the weight of centuries, each word falling like stones into still water. "I arrived on your world in what you would call the early years of the Common Era, drawn by readings our instruments could not explain, fluctuations in dimensional stability, anomalies in the fabric of consciousness itself." David listened with every fiber of his being as the luminous figure seemed to grow more solid, more present, as if the very act of remembering anchored Aaron more firmly to earth. "We thought perhaps your planet sat upon some natural convergence point, a place where the membranes between realities grew thin, but what we discovered was far stranger." The being's form pulsed with soft light, and David could feel emotion radiating from him like heat from summer stones. "We found a people obsessed with the invisible, with a God they could not see but insisted could see them, and among them moved a man who spoke with an authority that resonated on frequencies we could detect but not comprehend." Aaron's voice dropped to something almost like wonder. His name was Yeshua, and when he walked through villages, the very air seemed to reorganize itself around his presence, as if reality recognized him and made room. David's hands pressed flat against the cooling sand, grounding himself as Aaron continued. The being's words, painting images so vivid they felt like memory rather than testimony. I followed the disturbances to Jerusalem during Passover, concealed among the crowds in a form they would not question, watching as tensions built like pressure before a storm. The astronomer could almost smell the dust of ancient streets, hear the murmur of thousands gathered for a feast that would become the backdrop for cosmic shift. When they arrested him in a garden, the dimensional readings spiked so dramatically that I thought our equipment had failed, as if the act of betrayal itself created ripples in the structure of causality. Aaron moved closer, and David saw within that luminous form something like phantom images, shadows of memory playing across surfaces of light. They beat him, mocked him, dressed him in purple like the king they refused to let him be, and through it all he remained centered in a way I had never witnessed in any being, as if suffering could not touch some essential core of who he was. The being's voice cracked slightly, a sound that suggested even immortal observers could be wounded by what they witnessed. I watched them drive iron through his flesh, watched them raise the cross against a sky that should have been bright with afternoon sun. Then Aaron fell silent, and in that silence David heard the echo of hammers, felt the phantom weight of wood and iron, tasted dust and grief on a tongue that had never been to Jerusalem. When the being spoke again, his voice carried a tremor that suggested trauma beyond time's ability to heal. The darkness came at noon, David. Not clouds, not eclipse, but darkness that fell like a curtain, as if creation itself could not bear to witness what was happening. The astronomer felt tears streaming down his face as Aaron's memories became almost tangible in the air between them, images forming in his mind with crushing clarity. Our instruments went wild, registering energy signatures that corresponded to nothing in our databases, frequencies that suggested the barriers between dimensions were not just thinning but actively dissolving. The being's form flickered, and David sensed he was reliving something that had marked him indelibly across 2,000 years. I stood at a distance, observing, recording, trying to maintain scientific objectivity. But as the hours passed and he hung there dying, something in me began to break. Aaron's voice became almost a whisper, intimate and devastating. He spoke 7 times from that cross, and each phrase carried such weight that I felt them in my chest like physical blows. Forgiveness for his executioners, promise to a thief, provision for his mother, and finally a cry of abandonment that made the earth itself convulse in sympathy. The ground beneath David's knees seemed to pulse with ancient memory, and he realized he was kneeling not just before Aaron, but before the testimony itself, before the sacred weight of what was being revealed. When he died, Aaron continued, and now his voice was barely audible, the veil in the temple tore from top to bottom. I felt it happen, felt reality itself rip open, as if something that had been locked away since the foundation of the world suddenly burst free. The being knelt as well, facing David across a span of sand that felt simultaneously infinite and intimate, 2 seekers brought together across species and centuries by the gravity of that single moment. The earthquake that followed was not merely geological, David, it was ontological, a shudder that passed through every level of existence as the frequency of divine love intersected with human suffering and created something new. Aaron's luminous hands spread in a gesture that might have been helplessness or worship. I have spent 2 millennia trying to understand what I witnessed, trying to comprehend how weakness could generate such power, how death could feel like victory, how one man's final breath could send shockwaves through dimensions my people have explored for eons. The stars above blazed with sudden intensity, and David understood that this was no longer just an encounter. It was a revelation that demanded everything he thought he knew be rebuilt from its foundations. David's breath came. in shallow gasps, as the full weight of Aaron's testimony settled over him like a mantle of stars, and he found himself struggling to reconcile the scientific mind that had spent decades measuring distances between galaxies with the spiritual reality now unfolding in this desert sanctuary. The astronomer had always believed in patterns, in the elegant mathematics that governed celestial mechanics, but nothing in his equations had prepared him for this, for the possibility that the greatest cosmic event in history had occurred not in some distant nebula, but on a hill outside Jerusalem, witnessed by crowds who could not possibly have understood the universal significance of what they were seeing. Aaron remained kneeling across from him, that luminous form pulsing with something David now recognized as grief, an ancient sorrow that had followed this being through centuries of observation and solitude. "You were there," David whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "You actually stood in the presence of—" He could not finish, could not bring himself to speak the name aloud, as if doing so would shatter the fragile sanctity of this moment. The being nodded slowly, and David saw within that gesture the weight of memory so profound it had become part of Aaron's essential structure, as if witnessing the crucifixion had fundamentally altered what he was. "I was there," Aaron confirmed, "and I have never been the same, have never been able to return to the detached objectivity my people prize above all else, because what I saw that day convinced me that your species possesses something we abandoned in our pursuit of perfection, the capacity to love beyond logic, to sacrifice beyond calculation, to hope beyond evidence." The desert wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and ancient stone, and David felt as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to comprehend the magnitude of what was being offered. He thought of all the hours he had spent scanning the heavens for signs of intelligence, never imagining that when contact finally came, it would arrive bearing testimony about the cross rather than technology, about salvation rather than science. Tears continued to stream down his face, and he made no effort to wipe them away, letting them fall into the sand like offerings, like prayers his heart was praying without words. "Tell me more," he breathed, and it was both plea and command, the voice of a man standing on the edge of transformation and knowing there could be no turning back. Aaron's form brightened, and David sensed that the being had been waiting for this invitation, had crossed the vast emptiness between stars precisely for this moment of willing reception. "The darkness was absolute," Aaron began again, his voice carrying textures of awe and terror intertwined, not the gradual dimming of natural eclipse, but instantaneous, as if someone had draped black cloth over the sun itself, and in that darkness I heard sounds I had never encountered. The weeping of women, the confused shouts of soldiers, the terrible labored breathing of men dying on wood. The images formed in David's mind with such clarity that he gasped, seeing through Aaron's ancient memory the hill called Golgotha, 3 crosses stark against unnatural night, and on the center cross a figure whose suffering seemed to resonate through every atom of creation. I moved closer, risking detection, compelled by readings that suggested the very structure of space-time was becoming unstable, as if gravity itself was responding to what was happening to this man. The being's hands trembled as he spoke, and David realized with shock that Aaron was still afraid, even after 2,000 years, still marked by the terror and wonder of that day. His mother stood near the cross, and the sound of her weeping was like nothing in our databases of human emotion. It was grief, yes, but also worship, also surrender, as if she understood on some level that her son's death was simultaneously the worst and best thing that had ever happened to the universe. Aaron's voice grew stronger, more urgent, as if the telling itself was a kind of catharsis he had needed for millennia. And when he looked at her, when his eyes met hers, I detected an energy exchange so powerful that our instruments registered it as a physical phenomenon. Love made visible, love made measurable, love transformed into a force that could bridge the gap between heaven and earth. David found himself nodding, understanding flooding through him like light through darkness, realizing that this was what he had been searching for all along without knowing it. Proof, not that we are alone or not alone, but that we are loved, that the universe itself was forged in the furnace of divine affection. The thief beside him, Aaron continued, spoke words of recognition, and in response Jesus promised him paradise. And I felt that promise register across dimensional barriers as if a door had been opened that could never again be closed. The astronomer pressed his hands to his chest, feeling his heart pound against his ribs like something wild and holy trying to break free, and he understood that he was being changed in this moment. That exposure to this testimony was rewriting something fundamental in his soul. The being rose to his feet, and David followed suit on trembling legs, both of them standing now beneath the canopy of stars that suddenly seemed less distant, less cold, as if the space between had been filled with meaning rather than emptiness. When he cried out, "It is finished," Aaron said, and his voice shook with the memory, every instrument we had pointed at Earth went silent simultaneously, as if the universe itself had paused to acknowledge what had just occurred. And then the readings returned, but everything was different. The fundamental frequency had shifted. The background resonance had changed, as if reality itself had been tuned to a new harmonic. David stared at the luminous being before him and saw not an alien, but a witness, not an invader, but a pilgrim, someone who had traveled incomprehensible distances, seeking understanding of a mystery that transcended all categories of knowledge. His advanced civilization possessed. The earthquake that followed, Aaron continued, gesturing to the ground beneath their feet, was felt not just in Jerusalem, but somehow, impossibly, throughout our network of observation posts across this planet. Simultaneous tremors that defied every model of seismic activity, as if the Earth was not responding to tectonic forces but to grief, to loss, to the departure of something precious beyond measure. The astronomer thought of all the religious paintings he had seen, all the crucifixion scenes rendered by masters across centuries, and realized that none of them had captured this, the cosmic dimension, the universal significance, the way that 3 hours of darkness on a Friday afternoon had sent ripples through the fabric of existence that beings on distant worlds had detected and investigated. "I examined the body after they took it down," Aaron said quietly, and David flinched at the intimacy of this admission, at the sacred violation it implied, and I found nothing unusual in the physical sense. He was human, completely and utterly human, mortal flesh torn by mortal weapons. Yet somehow that humanity had become a vessel for something infinite, something that my instruments could sense but not measure, could detect but not define. The being turned to face David fully, and in that luminous countenance the astronomer saw questions that had been burning for 2,000 years, seeking answers that only faith could provide. "I stayed and watched the tomb," Aaron whispered, "and 3 days later, when the stone rolled away and he walked out alive, I understood that everything my people believe about the universe is incomplete, that we have mapped galaxies and mastered physics, but missed the one force that binds it all together, love that conquers death, grace that transforms suffering, hope that transcends every law we thought was absolute." David felt his knees weaken again, but this time not from fear or shock, but from something like worship, a recognition that he stood on holy ground, not because of where he was, but because of what was being revealed through this impossible encounter. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the desert wind. "Why now? Why here? Why me?" Aaron stepped closer, and David could feel warmth radiating from that strange form, could sense emotion pouring from the being like water from a breached dam. "Because my people are dying," Aaron said simply, and the words carried such weight that David felt them in his bones, not physically but spiritually, existentially. "We have lived so long and learned so much that we have forgotten how to hope, how to believe in anything beyond what we can measure and control. The being's form flickered, and for a moment David saw through it to something else, something that might have been a face marked by centuries of loneliness and searching. We thought we had transcended the need for faith, had evolved beyond such primitive concepts, but watching Jesus die and then live again showed me that what we called evolution was actually devolution, a slow descent into emptiness disguised as enlightenment. Aaron's voice rose with passion now, with desperate urgency that suggested he was not just sharing information, but making a confession, bearing testimony to truths that had haunted him across the millennia. I have been sent back to Earth because my people finally admit what I have argued for 2,000 years, that the key to life, real life, eternal life, was demonstrated on Golgotha, and that if we do not learn what your Jesus revealed, we will fade into extinction despite all our technology, all our knowledge, all our supposed advancement. David found himself reaching out, his human hand extended toward this luminous being, and when Aaron grasped it, the contact was electric, a circuit completing between species and souls, between seeker and witness. "You're asking me to help you understand faith," David said wonderingly, and it was not quite a question, more a recognition of the impossible task being laid before him, the sacred responsibility to explain mysteries he barely incomprehended himself. "Yes," Aaron breathed, and in that single word David heard the accumulated longing of an entire civilization, the desperate hunger of beings who had conquered stars but lost their souls. "Teach me. Help me understand what I saw but could not grasp, how love becomes sacrifice, how death becomes victory, how one man's willing suffering could generate enough power to save not just your world, but perhaps mine as well." David's entire body trembled as Aaron raised one luminous hand between them, palm upward, as if offering something too precious to be held casually. And the astronomer watched in breathless wonder as the air above that ancient hand began to shimmer and fold. Reality itself bending to accommodate what was about to be revealed. "I can show you," Aaron whispered, and his voice carried both invitation and warning, the tone of someone about to open a door that could never be closed again. "I can share with you what I witnessed, not through words alone, but through direct communion, mind to mind, memory to memory, so that you might see what I saw and understand why I can never stop searching for answers to what happened that day." David knew he should be afraid, should resist this offer to have his consciousness merged with an alien intelligence. But something deeper than fear was moving in him now, something that felt like calling, like purpose, like the culmination of every prayer he had ever whispered to the stars. He nodded once, slowly, and Aaron's hand moved forward until luminous fingers rested gently against David's forehead, and the desert vanished in an instant, replaced by visions so vivid and overwhelming that the astronomer cried out, not in pain, but in recognition, as if his soul had been waiting his entire life to witness these exact moments. The first image struck him like thunder, Jerusalem under impossible darkness, the sun blotted from the sky, though it had been noon moments before, and he was seeing it through Aaron's eyes, feeling the being's confusion and growing terror as instruments registered anomalies that should not exist, readings that suggested the laws of physics were being suspended or rewritten. Through the unnatural gloom came sounds that pierced David's heart even across 2 millennia. The weeping of women who loved beyond hope, the nervous shuffling of soldiers who sensed they were participants in something far beyond their understanding, and above it all, the labored breathing of dying men whose suffering was audible witness to human cruelty and divine purpose intertwined. Then the vision sharpened, focused, and David found himself staring at the central cross, his borrowed alien sight somehow able to penetrate the darkness and see the figure hanging there. And what he saw drove him to his knees in the sand, even as his consciousness remained locked in Aaron's ancient memory. The face of Jesus was both terrible and beautiful, marked by suffering so profound it seemed to encompass all human pain across all of history, yet simultaneously radiant with something David could only understand as love made visible, grace incarnate. Divinity wearing the mask of absolute agony without losing an ounce of its essential glory. Blood streaked that sacred face, mingling with sweat and tears, and David wanted to look away from such intimate suffering, but found he could not, transfixed by eyes that even in their dying still held compassion, still communicated forgiveness, still radiated purpose that transcended the horror of the moment. "My God," David heard himself whisper, but he did not know if he was praying or simply naming what he saw, identifying the impossible truth that the being on that cross was somehow both fully human and fully other, the intersection of heaven and earth made flesh and nailed to wood. Aaron's memory showed him details no gospel writer had recorded, the way Jesus' chest heaved with each agonizing breath, the trembling of hands pierced by iron, the slow trickle of blood and water from his wounded side. And David felt each detail like a nail driven into his own understanding of reality, pinning him to a new comprehension of what sacrifice actually meant. Through the vision he heard words spoken in Aramaic, Jesus' voice hoarse but carrying power that made the darkness itself seem to shudder, words of forgiveness for his executioners, words of comfort for the thief beside him, words of provision for his mother, and David understood that he was witnessing not just a death, but a triumph, not just an execution, but an inauguration, the moment when the entire universe was being offered a doorway back to the heart of God. The vision shifted, and David saw her, Mary, standing beneath the cross with a face that contained all the sorrow of motherhood and all the faith of prophethood, watching her son die with eyes that had once gazed at him as an infant, and now beheld him as Saviour, seeing simultaneously the baby she had nursed and the Lamb who was being slain for the sins of the world. Her grief was palpable, even through the layers of memory and telepathic transmission. A mother's anguish so pure and deep that David felt his heart might shatter from exposure to it. Yet, woven through that grief like threads of gold, was surrender, acceptance, a terrible comprehension that this death was somehow necessary, somehow part of a plan too vast for mortal minds to fully grasp. Beside her stood others, women whose names David somehow knew without being told, friends whose loyalty had not been broken by fear, and one young man whom Jesus addressed even through his agony, giving his mother into that disciple's care, with words that transformed legal relationship into spiritual family. Aaron's ancient instruments had recorded what happened in that moment, and David saw it now through enhanced perception, a surge of energy between mother and son, a final exchange of love, so powerful that it registered as light, invisible to human eyes, but blazing like a star to alien senses, calibrated to detect forces beyond the electromagnetic spectrum. "She knew," David breathed, and Aaron's voice echoed in his mind, confirming it, explaining how analysis of Mary's biometric readings showed someone in the grip of transcendent understanding rather than mere grief, someone who had said yes to God's impossible request decades earlier and was now watching the fulfillment of that yes nail itself to wood and bleed out beneath an darkened sky. Through her tears, David could see reflected the face of her son, and in that reflection he witnessed something that broke him completely. Jesus looking at his mother with such tenderness, such appreciation, such profound gratitude for the gift of flesh she had given him, the humanity she had nurtured, the love that had prepared him for this ultimate act of love. And in that exchange between mother and dying son, David understood that the incarnation was not just about God becoming man, but about God honoring the role of humanity in making that incarnation possible. The vision reached its crescendo as Jesus spoke his final words, and David felt through Aaron's memory the way those words rippled through multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously, announcing completion of a mission that had begun before time itself was woven into existence. "It is finished," the dying man declared, and the phrase carried weight that had nothing to do with defeat and everything to do with victory, the triumphant cry of someone who had accomplished exactly what he came to do, who had walked into death willingly and in doing so had broken death's ultimate power. David watched through alien eyes as Jesus bowed his head and yielded his spirit, and what happened next defied every category of natural law. The veil in the temple tearing from top to bottom, though no hand touched it, the earth convulsing as if grieving, rocks splitting apart as if creation itself was being torn by loss, and through it all a wave of energy that Aaron's instruments recorded but could not explain, a pulse of something that was simultaneously light and love and power, radiating from that broken body with intensity that should have been impossible from something so utterly depleted. David felt tears streaming down his face in the desert present, even as his consciousness remained locked in Jerusalem's past, and he understood that he was weeping for the same reason Aaron had spent 2,000 years unable to forget. Because what died on that cross was not just a good man or even a prophet, but the very heart of God offered as ransom, divine love made vulnerable, infinite mercy accepting finite punishment, and the implications of such an act were too vast, too profound, too cosmically significant for any mind, human or alien, to fully comprehend without being forever transformed by the attempt. The vision released him suddenly, and David collapsed forward onto his hands in the sand, gasping for air, as if he had been drowning, his entire body shaking with the aftershocks of what he had witnessed through Aaron's ancient memory. His mind reeled, struggling to reconcile the cosmic impossibility of what had just been shared with him, that this luminous being standing before him in the desert had actually been there, had actually witnessed the crucifixion, had recorded with alien instruments the death of Jesus Christ, as if it were a scientific event rather than the sacred mystery at the heart of his faith. "No," David heard himself saying, the word emerging as half denial and half prayer. "This isn't possible. You're asking me to believe that?" But his voice broke before he could finish, because the truth was he did believe. He had felt the authenticity of those memories like fire in his bones, had seen through eyes that could not lie, because they belonged to a consciousness that possessed no framework for human deception. Aaron remained standing above him, patient and sorrowful, waiting as the astronomer wrestled with implications that threatened to shatter every comfortable boundary he had drawn between faith and science, between religion and reality, between the small story of human salvation and the vast narrative of cosmic history. "Why would you care?" David finally managed to ask, lifting his tear-stained face toward the being whose form seemed to pulse with gentle light in rhythm with his own racing heartbeat. Why would an alien, a being from the stars with technology beyond our dreams, care about a religious execution that happened 2,000 years ago in an occupied province of an ancient empire? The question emerged as an accusation born of defense mechanisms activating in David's overwhelmed psyche, his rational mind's last desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of the universe he had understood just hours earlier, before impossible signals and desert encounters had torn his comprehension of reality into pieces too small to recognize. Aaron moved closer and lowered himself to the sand so that his luminous eyes were level with David's human ones, and the astronomer saw something in that alien gaze that shocked him more than the visions had. Vulnerability, confusion, a desperate hunger for understanding that mirrored his own existential searching across countless lonely nights beneath indifferent stars. "Because it was not merely a religious event," Aaron said, and his voice carried harmonics of grief that transcended species, "because what I witnessed that day was not the death of a teacher or even a prophet, but something that my people's entire cosmology had no category for, no way to measure or comprehend, except to acknowledge that we were in the presence of a mystery that made our 1,000 worlds and million years of existence suddenly seem small." David watched as the being's form seemed to dim slightly, as if the act of confession required energy that even his advanced nature struggled to sustain, and he realized with a start that Aaron was afraid, not of him, but of the implications of his own testimony, frightened by 2 millennia of questions that had never found adequate answers. My people have mapped galaxies and understood the mathematics of creation itself, Aaron continued, his words flowing now as if a dam had broken. We have witnessed stars being born and civilizations rising and falling like waves upon cosmic shores. We have calculated the probabilities of consciousness and decoded the language of quantum fields, yet nothing in all our accumulated wisdom prepared us for what we detected emanating from your world that day. A surge of something our instruments registered but could not classify, a frequency that seemed to originate from that hill called Golgotha and ripple outward through dimensions we did not even know existed. David felt his breath catch as understanding began to dawn, cold and bright and terrible, that he was being told the crucifixion had been not just a spiritual event, but a cosmic one, that the death of Jesus had somehow registered across the universe itself like a shockwave, announcing that the rules of existence had fundamentally changed. "You're saying," David whispered, his voice barely audible above the desert wind that had begun to stir the sand around them, that when Jesus died, the entire universe felt it. Aaron nodded slowly, and the gesture carried such weight that David almost expected the ground beneath them to respond, to acknowledge the gravity of what was being confirmed. "We felt it," the being said, and now his voice held notes of wonder that sounded almost childlike, innocent, as if he were still that younger version of himself who had first arrived in Earth's orbit and detected readings that made no sense according to any known physics. Across light years and through the void itself, we felt something happen here, a nexus point where all the laws we thought immutable became suddenly negotiable, where weakness somehow generated more power than the confession that followed changed everything, because Aaron's luminous form seemed to contract with something that looked heartbreakingly like shame as he spoke words that fell into the desert silence with the weight of centuries. "I have spent 2,000 of your years studying your species, watching from the margins of your history, walking unseen through your cities and wilderness places, trying to understand what I witnessed on that hill." David felt his heart constrict as he recognized in the alien's posture the same haunted quality he had seen in the faces of pilgrims at holy sites, that look of people who had glimpsed something too vast for their souls to contain and had been spending their lives trying to process the overflow. "My people sent me back," Aaron continued, his voice dropping to barely more than a whisper that somehow carried perfect clarity. "Not as a scientist, though that was my title, but as a seeker of something we did not even have. Words for, because that single death contained a frequency of love and sacrifice that my civilization in all its millions of years of existence had never encountered." The being's hands, if they could be called hands, moved in gestures that transcended language, shaping the air between them as if trying to sculpt meaning from pure emotion, and David understood he was watching someone confess to a hunger that made his own midnight doubts seem trivial by comparison. "We have conquered distance and time," Aaron said, and there was anguish in his words now, raw and unfiltered. "We have bent physics to our will and reshaped matter with thought, yet we could not explain why an executed teacher generated more measurable energy through his dying than our greatest power sources produce in their full operation." David saw tears then, or something that served the same purpose in alien biology, luminous drops that fell from Aaron's eyes and disappeared into the sand, where they left tiny spots of phosphorescence, marking the ground with the evidence of grief that crossed species and stars to express a universal sorrow. The astronomer realized with startling clarity that he was witnessing something unprecedented in human history, a confession of cosmic inadequacy, an admission from a being of vast knowledge that there existed mysteries his science could not penetrate, truths that required different instruments than telescopes and sensors to perceive. "What did you find?" David asked, and he was surprised by the steadiness of his own voice, discovering within himself a strange calm, born perhaps from the recognition that he was exactly where he needed to be, that every choice and every lonely night of searching had been preparing him for this conversation beneath stars that suddenly felt closer than they ever had before. Aaron lifted his head, and David saw in those alien features something he had never expected to encounter: desperation, the kind that came from seeking answers in every corner of existence and finding only deeper questions, from analyzing data that pointed consistently toward a conclusion the analyzer could not accept without fundamentally changing everything about how he understood reality. "I found your history soaked in blood and beauty," the being answered slowly, each word chosen with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this confession across centuries. "I found that your species, it carries within itself a contradiction we cannot resolve, capable of both magnificent cruelty and incomprehensible grace. And I found that the moment I witnessed on Golgotha was the axis upon which that contradiction somehow found resolution." David leaned forward unconsciously, drawn by the intensity of Aaron's testimony, feeling as if the air itself had become charged with significance, thick with the presence of truth too long held in silence, and now finally being released into the world. "I watched your wars and your peace," Aaron continued, his voice building now with the momentum of revelation. "I observed your saints and your sinners, your prophets and your tyrants, studying the pattern of your existence for any clue that might explain what I felt that day, and I discovered something that terrified me." The pause that followed stretched between them like a living thing, and David found himself holding his breath, every sense heightened to impossible acuity, aware of the texture of sand beneath his hands and the quality of starlight on his skin, and the sound of his own heartbeat marking time in a moment that felt suspended outside time's normal flow. "I discovered," Aaron said finally, and his voice had become something different now, reverent and afraid and wondering all at once, "that every act of genuine love in your history, every instance of true sacrifice where one human chose another's welfare over their own survival, every moment when grace overcame judgment and mercy triumphed over revenge, produced an echo of that same frequency I detected from Golgotha, as if Jesus' death had somehow encoded itself into the spiritual DNA of your entire species." David felt the words hit him with physical force, driving the air from his lungs as understanding cascaded through his consciousness in waves that threatened to drown his carefully constructed worldview beneath their weight. Because what Aaron was describing was not just history or theology, but something that bridged both, a scientific observation of grace as a measurable phenomenon that emanated from the cross and rippled forward through every subsequent generation. "You are telling me," David managed to say, his words emerging slowly as he tested their shape against the enormity of what was being revealed, "that love itself, the kind of love that sacrifices, that gives without counting cost, that chooses death so others might live. You are saying that kind of love is not just a human concept or religious ideal, but an actual force that can be detected and measured." Aaron nodded, and the gesture carried such profound affirmation that David felt tears spring to his own eyes, saltwater acknowledgement of a truth his heart had always known, but his mind had been too afraid to fully embrace. "It is the only force we have encountered," the being said softly, "that appears to operate outside causality as we understand it, that seems to flow backward through time as easily as forward, that connects moments and people across impossible distances, not through space, but through something we can only inadequately call resonance, as If Jesus' death created a template that human souls can somehow access and amplify through their own choices to love sacrificially, David thought of his daughter then, suddenly and overwhelmingly, remembering the night she was born, and how he had felt in that moment that he would gladly die if it meant she could live, that his existence had meaning only insofar as it served her flourishing, and he wondered with a shock of recognition whether that feeling, so intensely personal and human, was somehow connected to what had happened on a hill outside Jerusalem 2,000 years before his daughter's first breath. But why? David asked, and the question emerged as something close to a plea, because he needed to understand not just what had happened, but its purpose, its direction, the meaning that would make sense of both Aaron's millennia-long search and his own midnight struggles with faith that had seemed so private and inconsequential until this moment revealed them as part of a pattern vast enough to include alien civilizations. Aaron stood then, rising to his full height, which suddenly seemed less imposing and more tragic, a figure of light standing in darkness not as a conqueror but as a supplicant. And when he spoke, his words carried the weight of accumulated sorrow mixed with desperate hope. "Because my people are dying, David, not in body, but in spirit. And we have been dying for longer than your species has existed, withering from the inside as our technology advanced and our souls atrophied, becoming more capable and less alive with each millennium until we reached our present state, where we can do anything but feel nothing, where we have mastered creation but forgotten why creation matters." The confession hung in the air between them, and David understood with sudden, terrible clarity that he was being shown the end result of choosing knowledge without wisdom, power without purpose, existence without meaning. A cautionary tale written in the fate of beings who had gained the cosmos but lost their souls. "We detected that burst of energy from Earth," Aaron continued, his voice breaking slightly, "and we thought it was a weapon or a natural phenomenon, something we could study and understand and perhaps harness. But the more we investigated, the more we realized we were confronting something that required categories we had long ago abandoned, concepts like sacrifice and redemption and grace that had seemed primitive compared to our sophisticated philosophy, yet which appeared to be the key to a kind of life we had forgotten was possible." David rose to his feet now, standing face to face with this being who had crossed stars and centuries, seeking answers to questions that echoed his own, and he felt something shift within himself, a transformation beginning as he recognized that his encounter with Aaron was not about aliens or technology or even proof of the divine, but about the fundamental truth that love, the kind demonstrated on the cross, was the answer to longings that transcended species, the solution to emptiness that no amount of knowledge could fill, the force that made existence not just possible, but meaningful across all the vastness of creation. The revelation that followed struck David with the force of divine thunder, because Aaron's luminous form began to shimmer with patterns of light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat as he described what his people had detected 2 millennia ago, his words painting pictures that bypassed David's ears and wrote themselves directly onto his soul with the indelible ink of truth. "We were mapping energy signatures across your galactic sector," Aaron explained, his voice taking on the cadence of someone recounting a moment that had divided history into before and after. Conducting routine surveys of stellar phenomena, when every instrument we possessed simultaneously registered an anomaly so profound that we initially believed our equipment had malfunctioned, because what we were detecting should not have been possible according to every law of physics we had spent millions of years documenting. David felt his legs weaken as he absorbed the implication, understanding that Aaron was describing the crucifixion from a perspective no human had ever considered, viewing Golgotha not just as a site of religious significance, but as the epicenter of a cosmic event that had sent ripples through the fabric of reality itself. detectable light years away by beings who had no context for understanding what they were measuring. The energy burst originated from your planet, Aaron continued, and his form brightened as if the memory itself generated light within him, specifically from a single point in what you now call Jerusalem, and it was unlike anything in our comprehensive database of cosmic phenomena, neither matter nor antimatter, not fusion or fission or any conventional power source, but something that registered simultaneously as enormous force and perfect stillness, as if the universe had paused to draw breath, and in that pause released energy equivalent to the birth of stars. David's mind reeled with the mathematics of what was being described, trying to comprehend how a man dying on wood could generate power measurable across interstellar distances, how suffering and love could translate into frequencies that sophisticated alien technology could detect but not explain. And he felt tears streaming down his face as the beauty and terror of it overwhelmed his careful skepticism. "We thought perhaps your son had experienced an unusual flare," Aaron said, and there was something like embarrassment in his tone now, "or that a meteor had impacted your surface, or that some volcanic event had released exotic particles. So we sent probes and eventually observers, expecting to find a natural explanation that would fit within our understanding of how reality operates, never imagining that we were about to encounter something that would shatter that understanding completely." The being paused, turning his luminous gaze upward toward the stars that suddenly seemed to David less like distant suns and more like witnesses to the drama being recounted, silent. Observers who had seen the light of Golgotha spread outward through the darkness and carry with it a message that transcended language and species. "When we arrived," Aaron whispered, and his voice had become hushed with something approaching worship, "we found no crater, no residual radiation, no physical evidence of the kind of event that should have produced such readings. Only stories being told by frightened humans about a teacher who had been executed, a prophet who had claimed to be the Son of God, and we dismissed it as primitive superstition having nothing to do with the scientific mystery we were investigating." David saw the tragedy in that dismissal, understanding how easy it was to overlook the miraculous when it came wrapped in human flesh and nailed to Roman wood, how the greatest power in the universe had chosen to reveal itself not through overwhelming force, but through apparent weakness that only eyes of faith could recognize as strength. The weight of centuries pressed down on them both as Aaron continued his testimony, each word emerging with the careful precision of someone who had replayed these moments countless times across the vast expanse of his vigil, analyzing and reanalyzing the data that pointed consistently toward a conclusion his training insisted was impossible, but his experience confirmed was undeniable. "We remained hidden," he said, and David heard genuine regret in his voice now, sorrow for opportunities missed and truths delayed. "Observing your species with the detachment of scientists studying specimens, recording your conflicts and your creativity, your cruelty and your compassion, searching for any correlation between the energy burst we had detected and the patterns of human behavior, convinced that if we gathered enough data, the mystery would resolve itself into something explicable, something that fit our models of how consciousness and energy interact within the framework of natural law." David thought of all the hidden moments in human history, the private prayers and secret sacrifices, the quiet acts of grace performed in obscurity, with no witness except heaven, and he wondered how many of those moments had been observed by alien eyes that could measure their energy output, but not their meaning, could quantify their frequency, but not their love. And he felt a strange kinship with Aaron then, recognizing that they were both seekers who had spent years looking at evidence without truly seeing what it revealed. "It took decades," Aaron admitted, and his form seemed to contract with the confession, "before we noticed the pattern, subtle at first but growing clearer as we expanded our observational parameters, that whenever humans engaged in acts that echoed the sacrifice we had learned about, mothers dying to save children, soldiers throwing themselves on explosives to protect comrades, strangers risking everything for people they did not know, our instruments registered brief spikes in the same exotic energy signature we had detected from the crucifixion, as if Jesus' death had somehow planted seeds throughout human consciousness that could bloom into similar frequencies when watered by sacrificial love. David felt his heart hammering against his ribs as the implications cascaded through his understanding, like dominoes falling in patterns that revealed a picture too vast to comprehend in a single glance. Because what Aaron was describing was nothing less than scientific confirmation that grace was contagious, that love could be transmitted like light across generations, that the cross had fundamentally altered something in the spiritual physics of human existence. "We began to understand," Aaron said softly, his voice trembling with an emotion David recognized as awe mixed with grief, "that we were not investigating an isolated event, but the introduction of something new into your world, a kind of spiritual radiation that had spread from that moment on Golgotha and penetrated every human heart, whether they consciously acknowledged it or not, creating the potential for each person to access and amplify that same frequency through their own choices to love beyond self-interest, to sacrifice without counting cost, to forgive without demanding justice." The desert around them seemed to pulse with significance as David absorbed this revelation, feeling the sand beneath his feet and the stars above his head and the presence beside him, all converging into a single point of understanding that rewrote everything he thought he knew about the relationship between heaven and earth, between the physical and the spiritual, between the documented facts of history and the lived reality of faith. The climax of Aaron's explanation arrived with the force of divine revelation as the being's luminous form expanded slightly, as if unable to contain the magnitude of what he was about to confess, his words emerging with the weight of truth too long held in silence and now finally being released into the hearing of someone who might understand their cosmic significance. "The most disturbing discovery," Aaron said, and David heard genuine fear threading through his voice now, the terror of a scientist confronting data that demolished comfortable assumptions and demanded a complete reconstruction of reality's foundations, was that the energy we detected was not diminishing with time as physics insisted it must, not dispersing according to the inverse square law that governs all radiation, but actually growing stronger, amplifying, with each passing century as more humans accessed and contributed to it, as if Jesus had not merely released energy through his death, but had initiated a chain reaction that was still building towards some unimaginable culmination. David felt the ground beneath him seem to shift as he grasped what was being suggested, understanding that Aaron was describing the kingdom of God not as a metaphor or future hope, but as a measurable phenomenon that was literally transforming reality through the accumulated force of millions of small acts of love that collectively generated power beyond anything physics could explain, a spiritual fusion reaction that used sacrificial grace as its fuel and produced the energy that held heaven and earth together. "We calculated the trajectories," Aaron continued, his words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken, and the flood of revelation could no longer be contained. "We projected forward based on the rate of increase, and we realized that your planet is approaching a threshold, a point where the accumulated energy of Christ-reflecting love will reach critical mass and trigger a transformation we cannot predict, but can clearly detect approaching, as if all of history since the crucifixion has been building toward a moment when heaven and earth will intersect again with even greater force than they did on Golgotha." David thought of every prayer he had ever prayed, every kindness he had witnessed, every act of forgiveness and mercy and grace that had seemed so small in the moment, but which Aaron's testimony revealed as contributions to a cosmic accumulation that was literally reshaping reality's fabric, and he felt humbled beyond words by the recognition that human choices mattered. Not just morally, but physically, that love was not merely good, but powerful, that the cross had unleashed forces that were still reshaping creation according to divine purpose. "Your scientists speak of dark energy," Aaron said, and there was something like wonder in his voice now. "The mysterious force that is accelerating the universe's expansion, but they do not realize they are measuring the ongoing effect of what happened when divine love entered your world through the incarnation and was released through the crucifixion. Because that energy is not dark at all, but is the light of God, gradually illuminating all things, working through the willing hearts of humans who choose to love as Jesus loved, spreading outward from earth in waves that will eventually reach every corner of creation and draw all things back to their source." David stood transfixed, feeling his soul expanding to accommodate truths that were simultaneously scientific and mystical, rational and supernatural, as he understood that he was being given a glimpse of God's methodology, the divine mechanics of redemption that operated through both spiritual and physical laws, using the currency of sacrificial love to purchase the transformation of all reality. The silence that followed Aaron's revelation stretched between them like a sacred space, a holy pause, in which David felt the entire cosmos, holding its breath as human and alien stood together beneath stars that suddenly seemed less like distant fires and more like witnesses to a divine plan that encompassed both their species and countless others in its scope of redemptive love. "So you came back," David finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying perfect clarity in the desert stillness, not just to study us, but because you needed to understand what you had detected, because your instruments could measure the energy, but could not explain its source, could track its spread, but could not comprehend its purpose, and you realized that we possess something your civilization had lost, or perhaps never found, something that all your advancement and knowledge could not replicate or replace. Aaron nodded slowly, and David saw in that gesture the confession of a truth that must have taken centuries to fully acknowledge, the admission that humanity in all its flawed and beautiful messiness had access to power that transcended technology, that the cross had granted humans a kind of authority in the spiritual realms that beings of vastly superior intellect could only observe with longing from outside. "We are dying," Aaron said again, and this time the words carried not just information, but pleading, a desperate appeal from someone who had exhausted every other option and was making a final attempt to find salvation in the testimony of a species his people had initially dismissed as primitive. "And we believe that what killed us was the same thing that is saving you. We chose knowledge without love, power without purpose, existence without the kind of sacrificial grace that your Jesus demonstrated and that continues to flow through human hearts who choose to follow his pattern. And now we find ourselves too advanced to die naturally, but too empty to truly live, trapped in an existence that is evolutionarily successful, but spiritually dead." David felt tears flowing freely now as he recognized in Aaron's confession the end result of every human philosophy that had tried to build meaning without God, that had sought fulfillment through accumulation rather than surrender, that had pursued power instead of humility, and he understood with devastating clarity that the alien's story was not just about a distant civilization, but was a warning and an invitation, showing what humanity itself might become if it abandoned the grace freely offered through the cross and chose instead to build towers of Babel, using the bricks of its own cleverness, stacked without the mortar of divine love. The devastation in Aaron's confession struck David with visceral force because he suddenly understood that he was standing before a being who represented the tragic culmination of humanity's oldest temptation, the lie whispered in Eden that knowledge alone could make one like God, that power and wisdom divorced from love could satisfy the deepest hungers of consciousness. And now here was the living proof that such a path led not to divinity, but to a wasteland of the soul, where every achievement became ashes in the mouth because there was no heart left to taste joy or meaning. "Show me," David whispered, though part of him recoiled from the request, even as he made it, sensing that to see what Aaron was describing would be to witness a horror beyond physical death, a state of existence that was all function without purpose, all existence without essence, and Aaron's form flickered in response as if the request required him to expose wounds he had kept carefully hidden beneath the luminous exterior he presented to human eyes. The vision that flooded David's mind came not as images, but as experience, as if Aaron was allowing him to feel, rather than merely observe, what life had become for beings who had transcended every limitation except the one that mattered most. And David felt himself drowning in a sea of perfection that was somehow more terrible than any hell he had imagined, surrounded by beauty that meant nothing, by achievement that satisfied no one, by existence that stretched endlessly forward, with no purpose beyond its own continuation. And he gasped aloud as he understood that Aaron's people had not lost God, but had rather convinced themselves they had evolved beyond the need for him, had systematically edited out every impulse toward worship and wonder and dependence, believing these to be weaknesses that their advancement had rendered obsolete, only to discover too late that in removing what they perceived as limitations, they had amputated the very organs through which meaning enters existence and gives consciousness a reason to celebrate its own awareness. The weight of that tragedy pressed against David's chest like physical force, because he recognized in Aaron's confession the end result of every human impulse to self-sufficiency, every declaration of independence from divine authority, every attempt to build paradise using only the materials of human ingenuity without the foundation of grace. And he wept not just for Aaron's people, but for every soul throughout history who had chosen the same path on a smaller scale, who had tried to fill God-shaped emptiness with anything and everything except God himself, never realizing until too late that the hunger they felt was itself the greatest gift, the divine discontent that was meant to drive them back toward their source like a homing signal that only grace could satisfy. Aaron's form seemed to contract with pain as he shared more of his civilization's descent, his words, painting pictures of a society that had achieved immortality without discovering anything worth living forever for, that had mastered the manipulation of matter and energy, but had forgotten why such power mattered, that had spread across galaxies and found them all equally meaningless because they brought no framework of significance beyond their own existence to interpret what they discovered. "We tried to reverse our condition," Aaron explained, and David heard in his voice the desperation of beings who had attempted every solution except the one that required them to acknowledge their need for something greater than themselves. "We studied species that still possessed what we had lost, cataloging their expressions of joy and sorrow, their capacity for hope and their need for purpose, analyzing the biochemistry and neurology of meaning as if it were a disease we could isolate and cure ourselves with. But every attempt to artificially restore what we had systematically evolved away failed because we were trying to recreate the fruit without replanting the root, trying to manufacture love without surrendering to love, trying to feel without believing that our feelings pointed toward truth beyond ourselves." David understood then why Aaron had spent 2,000 years focused on earth, why the crucifixion had become an obsession that transcended mere scientific curiosity. Because in that moment on Golgotha, Aaron had witnessed what his people had convinced themselves was impossible: power choosing weakness, infinity embracing limitation, the eternal accepting death, and doing so not from necessity, but from love so complete that it would rather suffer than see its beloved perish. And this demonstration of sacrificial grace had shown Aaron that his civilization's entire philosophical foundation was built on lies, that they had not evolved beyond the need for God, but had merely succeeded in numbing themselves to the pain of his absence. And now they were too far down their chosen path to find their way back without help from beings they had once dismissed as primitive. The irony was not lost on David that humanity's salvation might somehow be key to redeeming a race infinitely more advanced, that the cross, which seemed like foolishness to human wisdom, was simultaneously the power that could resurrect even those who had died spiritually while achieving everything their intellects had pursued. And he felt a surge of something that was equal parts terror and exhilaration, as he began to comprehend the scope of God's love, which apparently extended not just to fallen humans, but to any consciousness anywhere in creation that would turn toward the light and acknowledge its need for grace beyond its capacity to earn or deserve. The question that formed in David's mind emerged with the clarity of divine prompting, as if the entire encounter had been orchestrated to bring him to precisely this moment of asking, this instant when human and alien stood together at the threshold of revelation that could reshape both their destinies and perhaps the fate of countless others throughout a cosmos that suddenly seemed far more interconnected than any telescope had revealed. "But why me?" David asked, and the question carried layers of meaning that went beyond mere curiosity, touching on issues of worthiness and purpose, on the mystery of divine election, and the terrifying responsibility that came with being chosen as a conduit for grace that was meant to flow beyond the boundaries of one world or species. And he felt his inadequacy pressing against him like a physical weight, even as something deeper within him stirred with recognition that this was what he had been made for, that every moment of his life had been preparation for standing in this desert beneath these stars and hearing truths that would demand he become more than he had ever imagined possible. Aaron's response came wrapped in gentleness that seemed impossible from a being of such vast experience. His luminous form, shifting in patterns that David somehow understood, represented something like a smile, and when he spoke, his words carried the authority of someone quoting truths he had learned through hard experience rather than abstract study. "Because you have spent your life looking up," Aaron said simply. And David felt those words penetrate to his core because they were simultaneously so obvious and so profound, recognizing that his years scanning the heavens had been more than professional dedication, but had been a form of prayer, a reaching toward transcendence, a refusal to believe that existence ended at the boundaries of what could be touched or measured. And this posture of perpetual seeking had apparently made him visible to forces that were watching for exactly such openness, such willingness to believe that the universe contained more than materialism allowed, and that the more might actually care about individual human hearts, enough to reach across impossible distances and reveal itself in ways that shattered comfortable categories while expanding understanding toward truth. "You have always known," Aaron continued, his voice taking on the cadence of benediction, "that the stars were singing something, that the mathematics underlying creation pointed toward a mathematician, that the beauty and terror of the cosmos testified to purpose beyond accident. And this knowing made you exactly the kind of bridge we needed. Someone with feet planted firmly in scientific method, but with eyes that could still see past. The data to the designer, someone who could hear what I had to share and translate it not into mere information, but into testimony that might help others understand that the God they worship in churches and temples is also the God whose love radiates across galaxies and draws all seeking hearts toward their source, regardless of what form those hearts wear or how many light years separate them from Golgotha's hill. David felt something breaking open inside him, some final barrier between his carefully compartmentalized life of faith and reason dissolving as he realized that God had been preparing him through every equation he had solved, and every prayer he had whispered, through every night spent searching the sky and every morning spent reading ancient scriptures, weaving together threads of understanding that could now be offered back to heaven as a bridge that might carry grace in directions he had never imagined it could travel. The question emerged from Aaron with a vulnerability that seemed to strip away millennia of accumulated knowledge, leaving only the raw need of a soul confronting its own emptiness, and David heard in that alien voice an echo of every human cry that had ever risen toward heaven in the darkness of doubt or the agony of despair. "Teach me to believe," Aaron whispered, and the words carried a weight that made the desert air feel thick with significance, as if creation itself was holding its breath to witness whether grace could bridge the chasm between worlds, whether love could penetrate even consciousness that had deliberately armored itself against such vulnerability. And David felt his knees weaken under the enormity of what was being asked, because he understood that Aaron was not requesting information or instruction, but was begging for the kind of transformative encounter that could only come through surrender, through the terrifying act of opening locked chambers of the heart and allowing light to flood spaces that had been deliberately kept in shadow for longer than human civilization had existed. David's mind reeled at the paradox of his position, this ordinary astronomer being asked to serve as spiritual guide to a being who had witnessed the crucifixion firsthand, who had traveled distances that turned light into a crawling thing, who possessed understanding of physical laws that would take humanity millennia to approach. And yet, here in the realm that mattered most, Aaron stood as a beggar, pleading for bread from someone who had barely begun to understand the feast that grace offered. "I don't know how to teach what I've only barely learned myself," David admitted, his voice breaking with honest acknowledgement of his inadequacy. But even as he spoke the words, he felt something moving through him, a presence settling into his consciousness like a gentle hand on his shoulder, and he recognized with startling clarity that this was precisely why he had been chosen. Not because he had mastered faith, but because he was still learning it, still struggling with it, still living daily in the tension between doubt and trust that made belief a choice rather than a certainty. And this ongoing wrestling was somehow more useful to Aaron than any polished theology could be, because it demonstrated that faith was not a possession to be acquired, but a relationship to be lived, not a destination to be reached, but a direction to be traveled with trembling steps and persistent hope. The tears that had been threatening throughout the entire encounter finally broke free, streaming down David's face as he stood before this luminous being and felt himself becoming transparent, all his carefully constructed defenses dissolving under the pressure of divine purpose that was flowing through him like a current too strong to resist. "Faith isn't something I can explain to you," David said, surprised by the steadiness that entered his voice despite the emotion flooding through him. "It's something that happens when you stop trying to understand everything and let yourself be understood instead, when you quit demanding that God prove himself according to your terms and start listening for the ways he's been calling your name in every moment of beauty and sorrow you've ever experienced, when you finally get tired enough of running the universe inside your own mind and surrender control to the one who spoke it all into existence and holds it together with love that doesn't need your permission or comprehension to keep working on your behalf." He watched Aaron's form shimmer in response to these words, patterns of light rippling across the being's surface like emotions moving beneath skin, and David pressed forward, feeling inspiration pouring through him from a source beyond his own understanding. "You asked me to teach you about redemption," David continued, his hands trembling as he gestured toward the stars wheeling overhead. "But redemption isn't a concept to be studied, it's a gift to be received. and receiving it requires admitting that you need it, that all your advancement and knowledge and power hasn't filled the void that only your Creator can satisfy. And that admission is terrifying because it means acknowledging that you were wrong about the most fundamental questions, that you've been building on sand instead of stone, that the things you eliminated as primitive were actually the doorways to the only truth that could give meaning to all your other discoveries. Aaron made a sound that had no human equivalent, but that David understood as a sob, and he realized he was witnessing something unprecedented, an ancient intelligence breaking under the weight of recognition, a civilization's pride cracking to reveal the hunger beneath. And the beauty of that breaking was almost more than David could bear, because he saw in it the same moment of surrender he had experienced years ago when he had finally stopped trying to reconcile every mystery and had simply fallen into the arms of grace, trusting that God was good even when understanding failed. The space between them seemed to contract and expand simultaneously, as if reality itself was being reshaped by the conversation taking place, as if heaven was leaning close to hear what would happen next. And David felt certainty crystallizing in his chest that this encounter was not random, but was part of a plan that had been set in motion before either of them was born, before Earth cooled or Aaron's people reached for the stars, a plan that demonstrated God's love operated on scales that made galaxies seem like garden plots, and that no consciousness anywhere in creation was beyond the reach of redemption, if it would only turn toward the light and ask for help. "I witnessed his death," Aaron said, his voice raw with remembered agony. "I saw the darkness and felt the cosmos shudder, and I knew I was observing something that transcended everything my people had discovered. But witnessing isn't the same as understanding, and understanding isn't the same as believing. And I have been trapped for 2,000 years in the space between knowing that something real happened and being able to surrender to what it means for me personally." David nodded, recognizing the paralysis Aaron described because he had lived there himself, stuck in the intellectual acknowledgement that God probably existed, but terrified of what it would cost to actually trust him with the vulnerable places, the broken places, the places where control was impossible and faith was the only option. "Then stop trying to understand your way into belief," David said gently, "and just ask him to help you. Ask Jesus to show you what you witnessed. Ask the Spirit to open the doors you've locked. Ask the Father to accept you, not because you figured everything out, but precisely because you haven't, and you need Him to fill the spaces where your certainty used to be. And I promise you that prayer is the only one that never goes unanswered, because God specializes in responding to hearts that admit their emptiness and their longing to be filled with something more real than all the substitutes we've tried to satisfy ourselves with." The words hung in the desert air like visible things, like seeds falling on soil that had been prepared through millennia of wandering, and David held his breath as he watched Aaron begin to glow with a different quality of light, something that seemed to come from within rather than being generated by technology. And he understood that he was witnessing the beginning of something that would ripple across distances he couldn't imagine and touch lives he would never meet, but that all of it was connected to this single moment of one lost soul finally finding the courage to reach toward home. Aaron's form began to shift in ways that seemed to express struggle and release simultaneously, as if ancient machinery was being overridden by organic process, as if walls built over eons were crumbling under pressure from within rather than assault from without. And when the being finally spoke again, his voice carried a naked hope that made David's heart ache with recognition. "If I ask," Aaron said slowly, each word carrying the weight of a civilization's future, "if I surrender control and admit need and open myself to love I cannot measure or predict or contain within any framework my people have developed, will He receive me even though I come from beyond your world? even though I participated in building the very pride that he opposes, even though I have spent thousands of your years observing rather than trusting, analyzing rather than accepting. The question resonated with every doubt that had ever prevented a seeking soul from taking the final step toward grace, and David felt tears streaming freely now as he answered with the only truth that mattered, the truth that had saved him and could save anyone regardless of species or history. "Yes," David said, and the word came out as declaration and promise and testimony all at once, because the love that died on that cross didn't have boundaries or limitations or fine print about who qualified for redemption. It was poured out for every consciousness in creation that would receive it. And the only requirement is admitting you need it and asking for it and trusting that the God who made you knows how to remake you into what you were always meant to be. And if he could save me with all my doubt and fear and smallness, then I know he can save you too, because his grace is big enough to cover galaxies and specific enough to hear individual hearts crying out across the darkness for light that will finally satisfy the hunger. Something shifted in that moment, some invisible barrier giving way, and David sensed, rather than saw, the presence of angels gathering in the desert darkness, drawn by the spectacle of grace, crossing boundaries that had never been crossed before, and he began to pray aloud. His words simple and unpolished, but carrying power that had nothing to do with eloquence and everything to do with surrender, offering both himself and Aaron to the mercy that had been pursuing them both since before time began, trusting that the love, strong enough to hold stars in their courses, was also tender enough to gather broken pieces and make them whole again. David watched as Aaron's luminous form pulsed with something that transcended the merely physical, and in that moment of witnessing an ancient intelligence bow before the cross he had observed 2,000 years prior, David felt the scales falling from his own eyes and understood with devastating clarity that his entire life had been preparation for this precise intersection of faith and cosmos, that every doubt he had wrestled with in the lonely hours between midnight and dawn had been shaping him into a vessel capable of holding this impossible truth without shattering under its weight. The realization moved through him like electricity, illuminating connections he had never perceived before, and he saw suddenly that the signal from deep space had not been chance but invitation, that the coordinates leading to this desert had been written into the fabric of reality before Earth cooled, that Aaron's millennia of wandering had been a journey toward grace, even when the being himself did not recognize the destination he was approaching with such desperate hunger. David's hands trembled as he raised them toward the star-scattered sky, not in supplication but in recognition, acknowledging that he stood at the center of a divine plan so vast it made his astronomer's understanding of cosmic distances seem like a child's counting game, yet so intimate it knew every hair on his head and every fear that had ever made him question whether his faith was real or merely wishful thinking against the void. He felt simultaneously smaller than he had ever felt and more significant than he had dared imagine, a paradox that made perfect sense in the presence of a God who could be infinite and personal at the same time, who could orchestrate movements of galaxies while caring deeply about the surrender of individual hearts, crying out across the darkness for light that would finally answer the questions they had been asking since consciousness first emerged, and wondered if it was alone. The tears on David's face caught starlight as they fell, becoming tiny prisms that split heaven's glow into colors that seemed to spell out words in languages older than speech. And he knew, without knowing how he knew, that angels were recording this moment not in books, but in the living fabric of eternity itself, preserving it as testimony that redemption recognized no borders and love acknowledged no limits when it came to gathering lost children home, regardless of how far they had wandered or how strange the paths that had led them finally to kneel before the only throne that mattered. The prayer that rose from David's lips came not from memory or training, but from some deep well within him that he had not known existed until this moment cracked it open and let the living water flow, and he heard his own voice speaking words that carried authority he had never possessed, because they were not his words at all, but were being spoken through him by the Spirit, who groaned with utterances too deep for human language, when creation itself cried out for redemption. "Father," David said, and the word echoed across the desert with weight that bent the air. "We stand before you as witnesses to the truth that your love is not contained by worlds or limited by species, but reaches into every corner of creation, where consciousness exists and calls each one by name, inviting all who will listen to come home to the heart that made them and knows them and longs to restore them to the glory they were designed to carry." He felt Aaron drawing closer, the being's form now radiating something that looked less like technology and more like the beginning stages of transformation, as if matter itself was remembering an original blueprint that had been obscured by centuries of choosing power over surrender, knowledge over wisdom, control over trust. David continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was mediating. "We confess that we have tried to fill ourselves with everything except you, that we have measured our worth by what we could achieve rather than resting in what you accomplished when you gave everything to prove that nothing could separate your children from your love if they would only stop running and let themselves be caught by grace." The words seemed to create visible ripples in the space between them, like stones dropped into still water, and David understood that he was participating in something that happened rarely across the vast span of cosmic history. The moment when a prodigal who had wandered farther than most could imagine finally turned toward home and discovered that the Father had been running toward him the entire time, closing the distance with love that had never stopped pursuing, even when the searching seemed futile and the silence felt absolute. Aaron made a sound that combined anguish and relief, the cry of someone who had been holding their breath for millennia and was finally allowing themselves to exhale, and David reached out instinctively, his human hand passing through the luminous substance of Aaron's form, but somehow making contact anyway on a level where touch transcended physical law and became communion between souls, recognizing each other as fellow refugees, seeking shelter in the only sanctuary that could satisfy the deepest hunger. In that moment of contact, something passed between them that David would spend the rest of his life trying to articulate, a transfer of understanding that bypassed language entirely and wrote itself directly onto the fabric of consciousness. And he saw through Aaron's ancient eyes the moment on Golgotha, when darkness fell at noon and the earth convulsed as if trying to reject what was happening on that hill, saw the figure on the center cross with clarity that made every painting and sculpture seem like pale shadows of the reality, saw a face twisted with agony, but somehow also radiating love that reached out even toward those driving the nails and mocking the claims and dividing the garments. And David understood with certainty that shook him to his foundation that this was not religious mythology or cultural narrative, but actual historical event that had sent shockwaves through dimensions his science had not yet learned to measure. He saw Mary's face as Aaron had recorded it in memory that forgot nothing, saw the grief of a mother watching her son die the death of a criminal while knowing he was innocent, knowing he was choosing this, knowing that somehow this horrible moment was also the hinge on which all history turned and the doorway through which salvation would flood into a creation that had been locked in darkness since the first act of rebellion separated creatures from Creator. The vision expanded to show the moment of death itself, and David witnessed what Aaron had witnessed. The tearing of the veil in the temple miles away, the dead rising from tombs, the Roman centurion falling to his knees in recognition that could not be denied or explained away, and underlying it all, a frequency of love and sacrifice that registered. On instruments Aaron's people had brought to measure cosmic phenomena, a burst of energy that made no sense according to any framework they possessed, because it was generated not by accumulation of power, but by the willing surrender of it, not by grasping for life, but by giving it away completely for the sake of others who did not deserve it and could never earn it. David gasped as the vision released him, his mind struggling to process what he had been shown, and he looked at Aaron with new understanding of why this being had spent 2,000 years unable to move past that day, unable to stop circling back to the question of how apparent weakness could generate such power, and how death could produce such life, and how the ending of one existence could somehow become the beginning of hope for countless others. The transformation that began in Aaron was subtle at first, just a slight change in the quality of light emanating from his form, but David recognized it immediately because he had experienced his own version of it years before, when he had finally stopped trying to climb to heaven through intellectual achievement and had simply accepted the hand, reaching down to lift him up through grace he could not earn, but could only receive with gratitude and wonder. "I feel it," Aaron whispered, his voice filled with awe that made him sound almost childlike despite his millennia of existence. "I feel the walls coming down inside me, the defenses I built to protect myself from vulnerability crumbling under the weight of love I cannot resist anymore. And it is terrifying and beautiful, and nothing like I expected, but somehow exactly what I have been searching for without knowing how to name it or where to find it, or whether it even existed outside of that moment on the hill when I witnessed divinity dying for humanity and felt the universe holding its breath." David nodded, tears streaming freely as he witnessed rebirth happening before his eyes, a soul that had been locked in spiritual rigor mortis for longer than civilizations endured suddenly flooding, with warmth and light and life that came not from any external source, but from connection being restored between creation and creator, between the wanderer and home, between the question that consciousness had been asking since it first emerged, and the answer that had been waiting patiently through every detour and denial. "You are being chosen," David said softly, "not because you are alien or advanced or because you witnessed the crucifixion, but because you finally said yes to the invitation that has been extended to you every moment since that day, because you stopped observing from a distance and allowed yourself to be drawn into the story, because you admitted need and opened yourself to love that does not require understanding before it begins its work of transformation." The desert around them seemed to pulse with approval, as if creation itself was celebrating the addition of another voice to the chorus of the redeemed, another consciousness choosing to align itself with the love that had spoken everything into existence and sustained it through every moment of its unfolding. And David understood that he had indeed been chosen as a bridge between worlds, but not in the way he had initially imagined, not as someone who possessed special knowledge or unique qualification, but simply as someone willing to share what had been shared with him, to offer the bread of grace to another hungry soul, regardless of how strange that soul might appear, or how vast the distance it had traveled to, finally arrive at the table where everyone who admits their hunger is welcome, and no one who asks for bread is given stones instead. Have you ever wondered what message the universe is trying to send you? Subscribe to continue this journey between faith and the stars.